everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy, and today we're going to be starting a series on the 3-act structure, beginning with Act 1. The 3-act structure is the most common way of structuring a book. In fact, most other plot structures like Save the Cat or The Hero's Journey are just more detailed versions of the 3-act structure. It's a very intuitive way of structuring a book, and so most books do fall into this structure whether intended or not. That's because this structure is just based around the very simple idea that every story has a beginning, middle, and end. And since most stories do have clear-cut beginning, middles, and ends, the 3-act structure is a very natural and intuitive way of structuring a book. So in this series, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the 3-act structure, looking at each act in depth. And of course, we're going to be starting with Act 1, which is the beginning. So let's start by talking about what the first act of a book should accomplish. The first act is the setup act, and it's going to be approximately the first 25% of your story. A strong first act paves the way for a strong book. So on the first draft, I would say that your first act is actually the most important act. Changing or editing the ending or the middle is a lot easier than changing or editing the beginning, because the beginning sets up the entire rest of the book. So if you put in the time and effort into writing a strong setup, that will set the way for a strong middle and ending. It's very easy to change the ending because it doesn't affect anything that comes after. It's very hard to change the beginning because that's where you lay the threads for the rest of the book. So on your first draft, I definitely think this is the place to put the most of your attention. And if you really put in the care into writing a strong first act, a strong middle and a strong ending will likely follow. The first act is essentially your introductory act. It's where you introduce all the different players and pieces of your story, and also where you get them all in motion. So let's look at some of the different elements of story and talk about what they should be doing in your first act. And then at the end, we'll talk about some general writing tips for writing Act 1. First up is characters. This is where you introduce your key characters as well as set up their trajectories for the rest of the book. For your protagonist, you want to give us a solid understanding of who this character is, their personality, but also their foundational backstory. And it's also really important to set up their goals, motivation, and internal and external conflict. There should be a sense of potential within this character. We don't want to read about characters who have no opportunity for growth or exploration. We want to be introduced to a character who's going to be interesting to follow, who's going to be a dynamic person, someone who promises to make interesting choices and have interesting things to still be revealed about them. You're setting up the foundation for a character arc by showing us what in this character needs to change and getting the reader invested in that future change. It's really important that we see an interesting person that we want to follow for a long journey. Novels are pretty long, and so we need to be convinced that this is an interesting person, someone who we want to spend 300 plus pages reading about, and a character who we believe isn't just interesting in the moment, but will give us some kind of satisfying payoff if we decide to go on this journey with them. Show us why we're rooting for this person or why we're invested in their journey. Not every character needs to be sympathetic and likable, but your protagonist should be someone that the reader is interested in reading about and invested in their journey for one reason or another. For your side characters, this is where you want to introduce the key players of the story. Give every character their time. You don't need to set up every single character in chapter 1. It's better to give every character their moment to be established so each character feels distinct. Introducing too many characters all at once can lead them to just all blur together. Beyond just setting up the important characters, it's important that you set up the key relationships and the relationships these characters have with your protagonist. You're setting up a dynamic character, but you're also setting up dynamic relationships. Just as we want to see an interesting character who we believe will be interesting to follow throughout the entire book, we want to see interesting relationships that will be dynamic and we believe will be interesting to follow throughout the entire book as well. Character relationships and those arcs are just as important as your protagonist's own arc in a lot of cases. So you're not just setting up the foundation for your protagonist to change, but for relationships to change and develop as well. This means identifying points of conflict and tension between characters, so there's opportunity for growth and change, but also for drama and conflict. Give us a sense of what the main relationships of this story will be. In any given book, your protagonist probably has a relationship with any other character who's introduced, and some of them will have a deep impact on the story, and others maybe more on the sidelines, so give us a sense of which relationships are the core of this story. In all likelihood, those are the relationships that have the deepest impact on your character's change over time, or the relationships that most directly impact their goals, motivation, and conflict. So what about the plot? Since this is an element of structure, what should the first act be doing from a structural standpoint? Of course, if you want a more detailed look at the plot points in the first act, then look at a more detailed plot structure, whichever one best suits your story. We have a whole playlist of plot structures. But I want to talk a little more broadly about what the first act should accomplish, in case you don't want to follow a more specific plot structure that lays out the first act beat by beat. First of all, and most naturally, is you need the initial setup. This is often called the world before the story. Basically, it's your character's life before the inciting incident, before the story has begun. You probably need less of this than you think you do, especially in a contemporary or realistic work. The more strange the world or your character's life is, the more you might want to include of the world before the story. Sci-fi or fantasy books often include more world before the story because that's naturally intriguing to a reader because it's new to us, even though it's normal to the character. But if you're just writing a contemporary realistic book and the main character's day-to-day life is not very interesting, we probably don't need much of it. We just need enough to get a sense of what's missing from their life. One of the most important plot beats, I would say the most important plot beat, in the first act is the inciting incident. Even if you're writing without any plot structure, this is how I write, I don't follow any plot structure, you should still be mindful of your inciting incident. It's one of very few plot points that, regardless of structure, pretty much every story needs. Of course, there are rare exceptions, but in all likelihood, your story needs and does have an inciting incident. This is an event that is a significant change in your character's life and is what sets the story in motion. I always like to think of it as the event that tips the dominoes. There's no one structure that all first acts need to follow, but regardless of plot structure, you pretty much do need an inciting incident unless you're writing something very experimental. In the vast majority of cases, it is the one plot beat and in an entire book that a story needs to make it a story. Otherwise, you just have a character in a situation with no sense of momentum. We have an entire video on the inciting incident if you need more guidance on it. It can be a bit of a tricky concept for new writers, but once it clicks for you, it'll be quite clear and quite obvious and very easy to apply. In all likelihood, your inciting incident will be fairly early in the story, in the first or second chapter. Some books even have them in the first scene. I personally like to place my inciting incident as early as possible. If it's later than the second chapter, it may be too late in the story, unless you're writing something that requires a very detailed setup. So in all likelihood, your inciting incident will actually be placed quite early in the first act, and a lot of your first act will be dedicated to the immediate fallout from the inciting incident. This is a huge change in the character's life, and there's a lot of ripple effects that will likely need to be explored from this event. Oftentimes, the character will initially refuse the call to action, and they will spend a good portion of the first act resisting this journey that they're going to go on, and then finally at the end of the first act they finally accept it, and that begins the middle of the story. In a lot of plot structures we refer to this as the break into two, right? The end of act one is kind of where the character accepts their fate and this journey truly begins. This can kind of be the first major choice. Again, your book doesn't have to follow this structure, but it is a common one, so especially if you're writing genre fiction, something very structural, this can be a good way to set up your first act. So that's what you want to see from a structure perspective. What about from a story perspective? So things that are beyond just plot and structure, but in your story's construction itself. First of all is you want a strong hook. A reader will be drawn into the story because of some combination of compelling character, compelling situation, and compelling conflict, and ideally all three of these things. You don't need something groundbreaking or overly shocking. In fact, if that doesn't fit into your story, don't force it. Instead, focus on creating compelling situations that promise exciting and interesting development. The first act is all about promises. You're going to be doing the setup here so you can pay it off later. So create interesting, compelling setups so that the reader is invested in the initial payoff. You also want to create a sense of atmosphere and tone. The tone can of course shift scene to scene, but for the most part is a fairly consistent aspect of a book. And you also want to establish the rules of the storytelling, the point of view and tense, the character's voice, and give the reader an understanding of how they will be interacting with and navigating the story's form. Just as you're setting up the story, you also need to set up the book in a technical sense so that the reader understands the rules of the storytelling. And And finally, let's just talk about a few writing tips for making it through the first act. Some writers consider the first act the most difficult, others consider it the easiest. I usually consider the first act the easiest to write because I think for me, writing setup is easier than writing payoff. But it can be daunting for a lot of writers just because of that whole blank page thing. It can kind of be nerve-wracking to jump into a new idea when you don't have anything established. So here are a few tips for getting into the first act. First of all, just get it all out. The first act is the easiest to revise, so don't worry about getting into messes. Make a mess and then fix it later. I personally like to do a deep edit of my first act once I'm done the first act, just because once you get everything out on the page, then you can really assess what's working and get all the pieces in order. You'll probably learn a lot about your story through writing the first act because that's when you're actually going to see things on the page. Some things may turn out differently than how they were in your head or how they were in their outline. That's okay, roll with it. Get it all out on the page and then reassess, make adjustments to your outline if you need to, make edits in your book if you need to. This is the easiest place and time to make adjustments to your book, and it's better you make those adjustments now than write the problems all the way through your book and then have to make edits to the whole book rather than just to act 1. Which leads to tip 2, I would actually recommend getting feedback on your first act if that works for you. Some writers don't like to get feedback while they're writing, but if you think this would be compatible with your writing process, I do think it can really help to get feedback on the first act for the same reason that I just mentioned. It's easier to edit the first act as a standalone piece, then make edits to the first act when you've written the whole book. Again, everything you write in Act 1 is going to have a direct impact on the rest of the book. So it's a great place to get feedback so you can set yourself up for success. Tip number 3, see what emerges. Even if you're a very detailed plotter, I would recommend being a little more flexible and open to change in the first act. Once you get into the middle of the book, then it makes sense to follow your plan more closely because all the pieces are in line, so now you can just follow those pieces. But in the first act, it is the most likely place to see change emerge. As you're bringing the story to life, see what emerges, and if anything interesting emerges that you want to follow, give it the chance. Just don't squash down new ideas. This is really the place to experiment because the stakes are so low because you're just at the beginning, and so it's very easy to make changes at this stage. And finally, tip number 4, be observant. I think it's really important, especially at this stage, to be observant of your own writing. Like I said, a lot of unexpected things might emerge, but you have to be on the lookout for them. Look for ideas or relationships that have a lot of potential that maybe you hadn't anticipated. Where's the heat between characters? Where's the tension? That's what you want to follow and expand upon. As you begin to write a story, it will kind of be getting its footing and figuring out what it wants to be. So be observant of those things. You can learn a lot about a story and a lot of things that will emerge subconsciously that may be more interesting than what you'd planned consciously. So that's it for this video. We'll be back next week with a deep dive into the second act. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time, bye.